Hello, everyone. This is Heather Ashamara, and this is our live streaming spotlight with Black and Brown Indigenous voices. And I'm so happy. This is our first one, and I'm so grateful that Marjorie is coming in to share today from her heart. So let's see, edit. Okay, sorry. And I'm also using new technology. So technology just was like, wait, we're having trouble. So let me see if I can fix that. Oh, maybe not. Okay, so I'm just going to remove that one. Remove. Bye-bye, Instagram. All right. So grateful to have all of you here. Marjorie's going to be sharing about trauma. Who knows what she's going to be sharing about? She's here, right? You can share whatever you want to, but we had originally talked about trauma and how to, especially for people that are Black, to navigate these times. But I really want to open up, hey, Adele, whatever comes up that you want to share, and that we've got people that will also ask questions. So you all are welcome to ask questions if you have them. And I just want to give just a huge warm welcome to you, Marjorie, and so much gratitude for taking time to be with our community today.
Thank you, Heather Ash. Hi, everyone. I can see some of the chat, but I am not a multitasker. And so I'll be focusing on maintaining eye contact with a camera. And hopefully later on, I'll make sure that your questions are answered. The other point I want to make is, as you can probably see, I have a dog peeking in the background. There will be several impromptu visits from various dogs as this goes on. So just get comfortable with it. As we get started. Hi, I see my wife is here. So hi, Jamie. Hi, Adele. Hi, everyone. Okay, first of all, thank you for taking the time to come to this talk. I mean, we are in the middle of, I saw this on as a Facebook meme, and it really hit me hard. We're in the middle of like the 1916 flu pandemic, and also 1968, the sort of major race riots in the United States. And we're supposed to keep functioning and to somehow talk about it. So I don't know what possessed you to show up today, but I'm really happy that you did, and that you're willing to look at these shadow issues that can be so difficult for us to hold on to in the midst of everything else that we're supposed to hold on to. So I appreciate you. My talk for today is titled "The Chronic Wound: Trauma and Healing from Racism." And it's a piece that I'm exploring as part of an academic exercise. And lo and behold, it's become directly relevant to this moment. And so the way that I'm going to approach it is the way that I approach my life, which is to say that I am a law professor and also a storyteller, novelist, and also a PhD student in human development. So you're going to get a talk that is this admixture of all of those things to arrive at this question of how do we explore the wound and how do we arrive at a healing moment, but recognizing that this is a chronic wound, that is, it is a wound that doesn't heal. And so how do we kind of live with that experience? Okay, so let me get started with the storytelling. I want to tell you about a Greek myth that I came across as part of my research that really got me thinking about this idea of chronic wound. And I'm just setting my timer so that we can keep to about 45 minutes. So the Greek myth is the myth of King Telephus. King Telephus was sort of born into trauma. His mother was raped, and his grandfather decided he should be killed so that he did not pose a threat to the throne. And so when he came from his mother's womb, his grandfather demanded that he be murdered. And of course, he was somehow saved, and he was left to be raised alone in the woods. And then he was saved very similar to some of the other biblical myths that we're aware of. But then he was saved, and he grew up to ultimately be king of other lands. And then who should come but Achilles, whom we all know from Greek mythology, to start a war. And in the process, Telephus was wounded. And he was wounded by Achilles, and the wound would not heal. And so for 8 years, he walked around with a bleeding open wound until he finally went to the Oracle of Delphi for a healing balm. And what he was told is that he could only heal from the weapon that had harmed him. And so the task for him then was to go back to confront Achilles and to demand a healing balm from the person who had harmed him. And after much trial and tribulation, I'm reducing the sort of mythical or epic nature of the story down to something that we can talk about in 5 minutes. But after numerous efforts, Achilles took a shard of metal from the arrow that he had initially pierced Telephus with, and that was what healed him. So this story has stayed with me as I've been contemplating and exploring, what does it mean to heal from a chronic wound, and what would that look like? And this idea that you can't heal by yourself, you actually have to heal from a relationship to the thing that harmed you in the first place. So that's what I want to explore today. What does the chronic wound of racism look like? What impact does it have? And I want to look at it from really 2 vantage points. One is the level of the personal, that is, what does that wounding experience look like, say, for me as a Black woman living in these times, but also as a chronic collective wound. That is, what does this wound do to our society? I know you feel it, certainly I feel it, a coarseness in our dialogue with each other, the numerous videos that show people with absolute fear in their eyes holding guns up to Black and brown folks, having a sense that the only way to survive this moment is by killing others. So there is a collective story to be shared, that racism is not simply an individual experience. It's not simply an experience that harms me. It is also an experience that harms the racist. That is, that harms the person invoking that way of communicating, that way of being in relationship that says, I am dominant, that if I don't dominate you, I will surely be killed. And then it is, moreover, a collective exercise. That is, it permeates all of our institutions and it harms them, it destroys them. As a lawyer, I'm particularly and profoundly impacted by the way that this moment is corrupting all of our judicial institutions, right? Certainly the peacekeeping institutions such as the police. I think whether you're white, Black, brown, anything, you cannot believe in this moment that our institutions are unaffected by racism. So let me start off then with the personal, what this experience is like for me and how I've approached it and tried to heal from it. So at one level, I am like fully human in this moment. I was telling Heather Ash before we started that for weeks, it was all I could do to just get out of bed, right? As much research, as much study, as much lived experience as I have had as a Black woman, Nothing could prepare me for this moment where we have a president in the White House who tweets, first of all, that he tweets. I could put a period in that sentence right there, but that he tweets then images of white power, the sort of Nazi symbols, that he tweets white men in golf courts yelling white power. And there are always mistakes, right? There are always, he didn't realize, there's always a justification. But we know, if you're paying any kind of attention, you know exactly what that dog whistle is about. So to be in this moment that racism is always about a power construct, I think we lose sight of the definition when we focus only on whether we like one another. I got to be honest with you. I grew up in New York, and so there's a way in which I don't like much of anybody, and it's a constant struggle for me not to judge people. That's not the same thing as what racism does, right? Racism judges you and then marshals the organs of the state against you to affirm that judgment, namely that your life is worth less and that your life can be subject to the whims of power, including being thrown into prison, including being killed outright in your bed, in a car, for alleged counterfeit $20 bill. The list goes on and on. So when Black Lives Matter becomes the mantra for this moment, it's both honest and also really sad, because the notion that I somehow have to justify that my life matters, I mean, I refuse to do that categorically, just as I would refuse to entertain the question of whether or not I as a woman have a soul, right? It's the same idea. These things are a given. It wasn't given to me by a white supremacist society. That is, my life wasn't given to me by a white supremacist society. The value of my life isn't given to me by a white supremacist society. So no one else gets to make that determination. And yet, at a practical level, it becomes necessary for us to have this dialogue with the state, that we will no longer sit by idly while our private prisons are kind of drowned in Black and brown bodies for the profit of shareholders and major corporations, because the state has made this determination that our lives are of no value, or are only valuable in the way that capitalism knows to value life, which is as a way of producing surplus for others. So there's that factor, right? So kind of recognizing this moment and all that it holds has a biological somatic impact. And for me, that impact has meant striving really hard to kind of meet this moment, right? To get out of bed, to kind of brush my teeth and brush my hair. And I hope you appreciate that I actually wore a dress and put the makeup on for you today, because it's not something that happens very often at this point. But that all of those moments are necessary. And then additionally, what is necessary is to use my gifts for this moment. And those gifts include the ability to speak out and to write about and to reflect on what's happening, because it becomes important for me to preserve my own psychology, my own state of being. So that's one aspect of it. That is a really, really difficult aspect to reconcile. I don't know about you, but when I learned about the civil rights movement, when I learned about Nazi Germany, I always had this vision of myself as one of those resistors, right? That I would do this and I would do that, and I would surely be marching with Dr. King and the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And And when this moment occurred, I just thought, I really don't want to be beaten, and I don't want to be thrown into prison. And those things really hurt. And so there's something profound about recognizing what it is that we are not able to do in this moment. And I am not able to stand before a bunch of cops and to swallow the feel of the baton, to swallow the gas, to swallow the sheer hatred and that sense of power run amok. That those are not the sort of resources that I could bring to this movement, but that there's something else that I could do. I could write stories. I can talk about what I know about what this experience does to our bodies and how we can heal. Hey, Jazz, I see my daughter's on here. And how healing is possible for us. Because one of the things that living in a racist society does is to corrupt our immune systems and our biology and our souls, and ensure that we die a faster, more painful death than everybody else. And so my work as a student of human development is to explore, is to look at how does racism impact our being physically and psychologically, and how can we heal from that? So one of the tools that I use is a psychological process called NARM, or Neuroaffective Relational Model, which is a psychological model born out of somatic experiencing. Some of you might be more familiar with that. But it is a model that understands how the nervous system works, and that things like racism elicit a nervous system response, and that we can actually regulate those things. And so one of the things that I'm really passionate about is working with the protesters and working with the Black community to really bring that healing modality to bear, so that we can live full lives, not only lives in relation to or in resistance to a system that seeks to dehumanize. We all know that saying, that it's not just about surviving, but that we must thrive in this moment, that Black joy is not only important to us as individuals, but it is an important political response to this moment. That the idea of finding our joy and not just living our lives as some kind of emblem of resistance for those who would actively do us harm is a political act. Laughing is a political act. And so that's part of what I do. The other thing that I've done, again, I shared with Heather Ash, is really and profoundly using the spiritual tools that are available to us, and specifically the spiritual tools that Heather Ash teaches. This recapitulation is one of the things that helped me get out of bed. This idea of separating out what is my energy and what is energy that's outside of me, that I can feel, but that I can also let go, so that I could do the work. So I don't know what it is that you're doing in this moment to kind of make sure you're able to meet this historic moment, but I hope one of the things that you're doing is the self-care of separating out what's yours and what is not yours. What are the things that are healing to you, and to use those as a balm, as a way of protecting yourself from the greater forces. So that's the level of the personal. And it's been really important for me to acknowledge that. The other part that I really want to talk about, and that I really want to center for the rest of our talk, is racism as a sort of collective experience and as a collective harm. right? And what do I mean by that? By now, you have seen any number of videos of armed white people, fear and anger in their faces, pointing their sort of semi-automatic rifles and AR-15s and what have you at protesters. Or just this morning, this woman who's caught in a traffic accident who rushes out of her car holding a gun against a Black family, really in deep fear that her life is the life that is in jeopardy in this moment. Or Amy Cooper coming up against a Black man who says, "Can you leash your dog in Central Park?" Right? Really having this moment, some of it performative, that is certainly true. But also you can see, right, this, she taps into something that's really important. That is that kind of white fear that can be marshaled, right? That can marshal the organs of the state, in this case, the police, against a Black man demanding that she abide by the rules and the law that everybody has to abide by. So what that question that gets raised for me in that moment is, how does it feel for white folks to be living in this moment of abject fear, to really be so convinced that their lives are at stake? And what does that mean then? What does that mean for the nervous system? What does that mean for your approach to the world and to life? How are you able to laugh and function and play and survive a pandemic if you think that your life is at stake when people are out protesting that they should have equal rights? So that's the exploration that I think is often left unchallenged, or that we somehow believe is somehow just a function of Donald Trump. Donald Trump didn't invent it. Donald Trump has simply figured out a way to harness that power for his own gain. Carl Jung really talks about the notion of the shadow, right? And what is the shadow? The shadow is the deepest hidden part of ourselves, right? Which we don't want to confront. And so by extension, we decide to project it onto others. And as a result, decide to fear the other rather than to fear that thing inside of us that we refuse to look at. And until we as a society, and particularly until white people are able to look at that deepest shadow aspect of themselves that constructed a society based on chattel slavery, that imprisoned people for 300 years and then spent another few hundred systematically creating institutions of power that would, quote, keep us in our place. Until we're ready to deal with what a collective wounding experience that was, there will always be white fear. And there aren't enough guns to justify that. And how do I know that? I know that because I happen to be born in Haiti, that hopefully you know is the only successful slave uprising in modern history. The slaves should not have been able to battle and win against Napoleon's army, and yet they did, right? At the time, the strongest army in Europe, slaves, people who were told that their lives don't matter, that their lives were constructed to be brute labor for white people to get their sugar, of all things, right? These folks were able to rise up and to slaughter the people who wanted to keep them enchained for life. And so I think about that story, and I think, I mean, the whole history of Haiti is another talk that I could give at another time. But it is emblematic of this moment, and it's an emblematic of white fear, I think. This notion that that what we're seeking, as yet another YouTube video person said, I don't remember her name, but she said something like, you should be grateful that what Black people are seeking is equality and not revenge. And that struck me hard, right? That white people, having understood the full nature, even if we don't acknowledge it, even if white people cannot acknowledge what it means to have been born into slavery, separated from our families, treated as chattel, that deep down, it does jeopardize, right, your existence, in the sense that that level of trauma doesn't just disappear. A huge part of what we do, right, is we suggest to Black people that the best way to deal with that is to blame ourselves. And so to tell ourselves that we simply have not availed ourselves of the resources available to us, to blame the victim, so to speak. And when the victim speaks out, to say things like, stop being a victim. That will only work for so long. That at some point, if we don't deal with the reality of the history of slavery and racism in this country and around the world, right? Colonialism was slavery by another name. If we don't deal with those things will come back to haunt us. There's no other way around it. And we can build prisons, but we can't build them fast enough. And we can hole up in our homes with our guns, but there's no safety there, right? The safety comes in actually dealing with the shadow, dealing with the trauma and the history, and then expunging it once and for all. So I think back to that story of Telephus having to go to Achilles, and the two of them having to work in concert in order for Telephus's wound to heal, is an important, it's an important roadmap. It's a kind of map of the soul for us that helps guide us into understanding what must happen in this moment, right? And so what happens if we don't do those things? What does the world look like if we continue to go on as we have? I think you have a perfect glimpse of what happens if we don't deal with the shadow. What happens is we enter a pandemic, and we are so incapable of meeting the moment that we allow the pandemic to run wild in hopes that it will murder the people that we're so afraid of, right? Even if that means it will also murder others, that is your families and your children. Because what we understand about what COVID-19 is doing is that it is absolutely hitting the Black community disproportionately. But disproportionately does not mean that the numbers, the vast numbers, are coming from our communities. It simply means that it's happening as a percentage, it's happening to a bigger percentage of the Black community than one should expect and anticipate. Although if you understand how racism works, how a healthcare system that is also founded in racism works, you would understand why that's so. But it also means that we're allowing our parents and grandparents to die as a result. We're allowing our young folks in their 20s and 30s to suffer this disease and to have the effects of that course through their systems for the rest of their lives, right? So when COVID-19 impacts the lungs, we're talking about a decreased ability to breathe for the rest of your life. We're talking about a disease that impacts all of the organs of the body. And we're saying that it's okay to simply have a hands-off approach. I mean, have you looked at the numbers of people in nursing homes that have been ravaged by this disease, that have died alone because their families could not visit them? So in their final moments, in the moments where they're really focusing in on what's most important to them, which is their relationships and their families and those they are leaving behind, they don't have the capacity to say goodbye. This is what our system, this is the collective experience of racism, right? This is what corruption of our systems looks like. In other words, because we've been sold this story that somehow COVID-19 has become a Black disease, right? That it's only killing Black people, we're okay with this idea that the lives of Black people are expendable. And so as a result, we're allowing this disease to run rampant. But what it's doing is it's corrupting the deepest hearts of us. And what does it mean for us as a society when we recognize this is who we are? I know I had this sort of big come to Jesus moment where I realized that I simply do not have the courage to do as my daughter did, go out in the middle of a pandemic and rage against the machine. I was not doing that. And it was actually really hard for me to come to that moment to recognize that I'm not willing to do that. It changed how I saw myself. It caused me to question then, what is it that I am willing to do? Similarly, if we as a society are unwilling to question, what does it mean to be a culture that allows our elders to die alone, to die in fear, to die of a disease because we didn't care enough to spare them that painful homegoing? Who are we then? Who are we as a society? And how does that change us? I mean, when you think about those horrible moments of our history, did you imagine yourself to be the villain? Did you think that you were one of the bad guys? But that's who we are in this moment. We are literally one of the bad guys, unless we're willing to look at the shadow and to respond to it, to kind of say, there are worse things in the world than dealing with the history of trauma that slavery and racism have elicited. If we're able to do that, then we're able to do all other sorts of things. That is, looking at our institutions, both our courts and our police, and to say, there are ways in which we can make it better. There are ways in which we can make it more just, more fair, more inclined towards preserving the rights of the least of us, because in so doing, it ensures that we also preserve the rights of those of us who have access to far more resources. So finally then, I want to explore what healing would look like. If we can't imagine a more just society, it can't arise, right? And so what do we imagine for ourselves? What does this sort of healing look like? What does a modern society, not constructed by racism and white supremacy, but constructed by the very promise that the Declaration of Independence offers, right? That our Constitution offers, this idea that that all of us are equal, not because certain institutions or certain people decree it, but because we were born that way. So if we start from that place, if we imagine a world actually founded and constructed with those principles in mind, what would it look like? Well, it might look like a system in which we have a bona fide healthcare system that is accessible for all. How can we be the most powerful, the richest country in the world, and yet also be the only developed country without universal health care? The only developed country in which our healthcare is tied to our jobs, so that when 40 million Americans lose their jobs, they also lose their healthcare in the middle of a pandemic. So when we need access to care the most, that's when we've lost it. This isn't just happening to Black people. It's happening to 40 million Americans, right? And what does it mean to not have health care when you're able to catch a disease that doesn't distinguish, right? That is capable of masking itself, that is capable of waiting far longer than you, right, to enter your system and to cause all sorts of havoc. If the idea is that you can live in your apartments and your homes and wait out the disease, wait out the virus, that's just wrong. At some point, we're not going to be able to do that, and it'll be waiting for us. So healing from this chronic wound would mean imagining a system of healthcare for all of us, right? That is not predicated on preventing some of us from accessing the resources that aren't scarce. They're not scarce, actually. They're actually abundant. And we could have healthcare for everybody. We know it's possible because we've actually seen others do it. And as a result, their approach to this pandemic has been markedly different, right? And so if you look at New Zealand or Canada or South Korea, all of those countries have had a very different approach to the virus and have been far more successful than we have. And all the naysayers that say, well, we have more people, right? As if that is the answer. We have more people and more resources. We should be doing a better job. What else would healing look like, right? I can imagine lots of things about how our universities would be different, how our students would have access to an education that didn't require them to go into debt. My students, law students, it's not uncommon for them to graduate with $200,000 of debt before they have worked a single day as a lawyer. I mean, can you imagine that? Perhaps some of you don't have to imagine it. Perhaps you're actually living it. But that used to be a mortgage, a 30-year mortgage, and now it is a debt in addition to a mortgage. How do they go out and reconstruct our justice systems, our judicial institutions, our peacekeeping institutions? How do they do that when they're bogged down with $200,000 of debt? We could do things differently. And if our energy wasn't taken in either suppressing the shadow or constructing it as a barrier to the pain we think we'd feel by dealing with it, we could focus that energy on an educational system that made sense, right? We could focus that energy on other things like housing. How can we have both empty houses and homeless people at the same time, right? Again, all of this demonstrates to us that it's not scarcity. It's not that we don't have these things. It's that we choose not to respond to these problems. for one reason or another. And the reason I'm sharing with you is not just racism, but why we constructed racism in the first place. This sense of the other, this sense of needing to construct barriers to the deepest parts of ourselves that we believe are too painful for us to touch, for us to look at, for us to heal from. So by virtue simply of dealing with that sort of psychic, physical, emotional, psychological wound of racism, we could actually construct a society that looks far better than the one we've constructed now, in which a few of us, there are 800 billionaires in the United States. The billionaires have made more billions in the pandemic, and the rest of us are jobless and without health care and so terrified that we will not be able to feed and clothe ourselves that we're willing to go out and work in the middle of a pandemic. So that's the two possibilities, the two worlds, right? One that is our deepest wounding, and one that is possible if we are capable of looking at our shadow and dealing with it. So as I wrap up, I want to share with you a final, I guess I'll share with you a, not so much a story, but an aspect from my Haitian culture, which is a song. And I'm not a singer, so I apologize in advance, but let me set it up for you. In Haitian culture, there is what we call Erzuli, the goddess of love, the goddess of women and children. And her job is to protect the ones that society does not protect, right? And so she is the fiercest protector, and she will cut you, right? If you harm women and children. And so there's a song that you sing to invoke the protection of Erzuli. And it seems to me the kind of best way of closing out this session where I turn to your stories. And so I'll sing the song and then I'll tell you what it means, okay? So it's, so the song to invoke Erzuli goes something like this. Noye map noye, noye map noye, Erzuli souwe mwen tombe nan d'lo, prom non, sauve la vie an mwen noye map noye. And so what it means is drowning, I'm drowning, drowning, I'm drowning. Erzuli, if you see me fall in the water, save me, take my life. Drowning, I'm drowning. And that's what it feels in this moment, that we're drowning and that we don't have to, that there is a possibility to be saved. And the way to our salvation is for us to turn towards one another, to look at the chronic wound, to heal it, right? As a piece, the source of our wounding is both the source of our healing. And so that's what I wish for us. That's what I wish for you. That's what I wish for me. That's what I wish for the collective. Thank you so much for being here. It's been a real honor. I'd love to answer any questions if you have them.
Thank you so much. That was so many moments where I had the chills, where I was like, yes, yes.
Yes.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, and anybody who's live, if you want to share questions, or Sandra also wrote beautiful, we have hearts. We can hang out for a couple more minutes. If anybody has questions or shares, please feel free to share. We'll let Marjorie read the feedback.
I love all of these, to see all of my family and friends here. Hi, everybody. It's awesome to see you.
I love it. Adele just wrote, I will nominate you for office. I agree.
Hi, Kathy.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Robin. I really appreciate you being here.
You are such a treasure, and I love how you wove in your personal stories, your research, and the stories that help us to, what a powerful thing to really hold that place of this is a chronic wound, and the way to heal it is with each other.
Yeah.
And being in relationship to the shadow and really facing it and going through.
Absolutely. And it's so funny, Heather Ash, because I have often felt like all of these disparate parts of me, right? Like I walk into the law school classroom and I think, I can't share storytelling. And I go into storytelling spaces and I'm like, oh, I can't say that I'm a lawyer. Linear thinking and spirituality. And so the task now I'm recognizing, when you hit middle age, I hit 50 this year. When you hit middle age, you really recognize that the task is to bring all of our parts together and to show up as fully ourselves in all of those moments. So I'll walk into my law school classroom and share fairy tales all the time. And so I have my students like applying legal concepts to fairy tales. It's hilarious and it's fun, and in these other spaces doing the same thing, because what we need to face this moment, the sort of the trauma is so great. We really need all of our tools, all of our gifts. No single one of them will do. I used to think I became a lawyer, or I decided to become a lawyer when I was 9 years old, because I learned about Thurgood Marshall in school, and I decided I wanted to be Thurgood Marshall. And then, of course, what we recognize in this moment is that law does not have the answer to all of the problems that are facing us. It's not possible. Law is not even primarily about our healing, right? It's about constructing institutions that maintain systems of control. And if it's just and fair, then our society will reflect that. But it doesn't deal with the personal pain, right? And so that's why it's important for all of our communities to marshal ourselves and our gifts, including our spiritual communities, to do what needs to be done for our healing and for our rebirth. Hi, Lynn. Lynn says, thank you, Marjorie. My therapist just told me we cannot have a reckoning without our ugly denial coming forth. Oh, yeah. That feels really true, right? And it also feels like we're going to die as a result. And in some ways, there's truth to that. There is, right? This idea of like a birth, death, rebirth that must happen. And we will look different on the other side than we did going in. And so we can imagine just how terrifying that death will be. What we forget to think about is what rebirth looks like on the other side. And that's what we must imagine into being.
Yes, perfect. And hold that vision of where we're going. I think sometimes in the middle of the chaos that we're in, the middle of the transformation, the temptation is, let's just go back to what was before. But
it's
not possible. And we need to keep visioning what else could we do. And I love that you shared so many different, like, how could healthcare be different? How could law be different? How could our relationships with each other be different? And that we don't do that as just a concept, but that we actually do the research and the reading and the exploration and going into our depths, and find people that are able to vision that. Sometimes I get so overwhelmed because I'm like, I don't know what we're going to do next. But there are people that do have vision.
Yes, because they've been using their gifts, right? I mean, the whole prison abolition movement that has now become sort of a mainstream idea is not something I was knowledgeable about either, right? And yet, when you look at it, you see that people have done the deep work to create something, imagine something that is far better than what we have now. I mean, we have prison industrial complex corporations that are traded on the stock exchange. How perverse is that? Where the incentive is to create and construct kind of people as illegal, right? That kind of a society, it permeates everything and it corrupts and pollutes everything.
Yeah. And we have to face it and really learn and trust that there's people. I was reading a beautiful article yesterday about centering Black voices and Black action. And you mentioned that as well, of like the people that have been the most impacted and the most segregated and the most marginalized are the ones that are actually going to have the vision of how to heal, because they're holding everyone. And I think the fear of white people is like, oh my God, they're going to come and do what we did to them. That's the deepest fear, right? And it's like, actually, no, sweetheart. They, they know how to hold love.
And that's the other thing that we benefit from. So, for example, looking at the healthcare system, who has the best knowledge of it? The disabled community. They have fought forever. They understood, first of all, what it meant, right, to live in a world that said basically their lives didn't matter, let them die. Whereas the rest of us were suddenly surprised when that was the mantra of the pandemic, that we should let our elders die because they've lived a long and good enough life. And so let's move on.
Yeah.
We're all shocked. We don't have the sort of resources and the language available to us immediately to be able to respond to that. Some of the best critiques I saw were from the disabled community that has been dealing with this forever, been told that basically if you're not an able-bodied person, that your life doesn't matter. And so the beauty of this and the beauty of having both academics and activists is we have language around this, right? So standpoint theory, for example, which came out of feminism, recognized this, which said that it's important to look at in any sort of deep question for which we have no resources. It's important to look at the people who are most marginalized by the problem, because they're the ones who have figured out both how to maneuver and to live in that world, and also how to transcend it, right? How to sort of live joyfully in this moment. And they can provide the tools, the resources, the imagining that we can't, like one of the things that hit me hard when I was really focusing in on what the disabled community had to say is one person asked a simple question that if you came home today in a wheelchair, right, would you be able to even climb up on your bed? I thought, is that a question you have ever asked yourself? Because that's not a question I have ever asked myself. And the truth of the matter is the answer is absolutely not. First of all, we live on a second story. I would never be able to even get up the stairs, let alone go into my room. And yet, if you think about when the disabled community asks themselves that question, what do? We got the Americans with Disabilities Act. We've got those cutouts in the sidewalk that we don't even notice anymore that are so normal. But it helps all of us, right? It doesn't help just the blind or people in wheelchairs. It helps all of us. And the beauty of this is by virtue of looking at the people who've been most marginalized for any one question, is we get solutions that make the world better for all of us, And so you can have these sort of fear-based approaches that what's really going to happen is that, they will turn against us and do to us what we did to them, and live in fear, right, with your gun. Or you can decide, right, to face your own fear and together construct a society that makes more sense for all of us.
So beautifully said. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful that you took the time to join us. And thank you to everybody that watched live. And for those of you that are watching the recording, feel free to email if you have any questions or just any love that you want to share to Marjorie. I can pass it on to her.
I'd love that. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate you literally putting your money where your mouth is, right? Like sharing your platform in ways that are sort of concrete and real, and that make a difference in everyone's lives. And thank you for that recapitulation practice.
Oh,
That helped me enormously.
You're so welcome, sweetheart. Yeah, I'm so grateful to have the capacity to offer tools and to offer space for voices that aren't as heard as they should be. Yes. For all of us to be able to hear your wisdom and your brilliance and your beauty. So thank you so much. Much love to everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.